reason why I know all of these numbers is because these were my own numbers. I went into this particular research bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to try to get some definitive numbers around the merits of investing in a self-managed superannuation fund for me. I came out the other end of it and concluded that it wasn't for me at all. And I was so shocked by the numbers and the magnitude of the numbers that I want to make sure that as many Australians as possible see that. Hey everyone, James O'Reilly here from Northeast Wealth, and I'm here today to talk to you about the merits of buying a property in a super fund and running a direct comparison. Now, as a bit of background to this, I was on the Rask 2 Cents podcast a couple of weeks ago and talking specifically about this comparison and talking about my numbers. And since then, I've had a lot of people go to town on me. I've had some amusing messages on YouTube. I've had a couple of people contact me on LinkedIn with really ridiculously critical things to say and demanding that they see my numbers. So I'm going to give those to you in this session, and you can see all those numbers and you can see how they stack up. But I'm telling you that they do. So let's jump straight in. First things first, general advice disclaimer. Hopefully you have read that. If you haven't already, press pause, read it. Let's get on with things. Let's get down to business. So firstly, the backdrop. Every year, as it says, thousands of Australians look to set up self-managed superannuation funds. And one of the primary reasons that people do it is this motivation to buy a property inside your super fund. This is not only something that a lot of Australians like, just by default, a lot of Australians like bricks and mortar, but it is heavily sold by financial advisors. It's heavily sold by property specialists and mortgage brokers and in some cases accountants and a truckload of other professionals. Many Australians that do go down this path don't undertake proper advice or analysis as to whether or not it's the right decision for them. And also things have changed significantly in terms of the lending backdrop and what's available through a self-managed superannuation fund. And it's changed so significantly that it really has resulted in me questioning whether or not that strategy still stacks up. Now, I also note that, as it says here, property holding costs, professional management fees, they're also rising, and that's something to remain mindful of. Now, the reason why I know all of these numbers is because these were my own numbers. I went into this particular research bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to try to get some definitive numbers around the merits of investing in a self-managed superannuation fund for me, and I came out the other end of it and concluded that it wasn't for me at all. And I was so shocked by the numbers and the magnitude of the numbers that I want to make sure that as many Australians as possible see that data. So let's jump into this particular scenario. We've got Jane here. Jane's 40 years old. Jane works as a full-time senior lawyer. She's got 400K super balance and an income of $180,000 per annum. So well played, Jane. You're doing a brilliant job. She wants to grow her super as rapidly as possible, and she's open to high growth investments. Now, very quickly, I can appreciate that this is not the profile of the average Australian, but if you wish, you could also take the view of saying this is Jane and Tom. They're both 40, their combined super balance is 400K, and their combined household income is 180K. That gives us a better, or if you want to use that scenario, then it gives you a better depiction. Regardless, the numbers stack up almost irrespective of how this works. So what I went about doing was punching these numbers in and saying, well, if you have a high growth superannuation fund versus having geared growth, which some of you might understand is that there are specific investments where you can invest and they will actually borrow money to invest even more, and it gives you leverage into, for example, share markets and the like, versus owning a self-managed superannuation fund with an investment property. And I was surprised that the differences were pretty significant across all three. In fact, if scenario one, Jane was finishing up with in 15 years' time, so that would be when Jane is 55. She has a $1.5 million, $1.6 million superannuation balance. Scenario two was about a $2.05 million superannuation balance, so about 400 grand higher. And scenario three was a $2.7 million superannuation balance. So huge differences between the three. The big surprise for me, though, was that the loser out of these was the SMSF with the investment property. That really blew me away. And the winner by a distance was the geared superannuation investment, and then in the middle was the high growth. The magnitude of the loss here really stood out to me. So I am going to take you through my numbers right now. So this is exactly the same spreadsheet that you can see. I've taken the liberty of putting it on Google Drive, and I'm also going to include the link. So if you want to play with these numbers, obviously download your own version of it and then go to town. Go for it. The numbers stack up; they are correct. So I'm confident saying that you're going to reach similar conclusions. And if you reach wildly different conclusions, it's probably because your foundational numbers are unrealistic. So let's take you through each of these and how I came to these numbers. Firstly, we're going to start off with your traditional high growth investment. So this is a pretty simple model. You've got Jane's starting balance of 400K. The growth is 8.1%. Just to be clear, that's super data or super ratings data on the average long-term return for a growth investment. Now, the actual return is 9%, but then you take off around about 10% tax per annum. I can hear the people saying, wait, super tax is 15. Yes, it is. But by the time you add franking credits and some other things, normally the long-term average is about 10%. So that's why we've got 8.1 as a net of fees return. And again, that's consistent with long-term data. So the growth is 32,400 as in 8.1% on top of the 400K. Now I note, of course, superannuation doesn't move in a linear way, but we are doing a long-term model, and therefore it's reasonable to think that if it just tracks to that over the long term, that's roughly where you're going to land. Jane's got contributions of $17,000, so basically $20,000 of contributions a year, and then you've got 15% tax on the way in. There are also fees. Most superannuation funds do charge a fee of some description. It might be a platform fee, administrative fee, sometimes both, and often they're already embedded into this return. So this particular earnings or the rate of return includes the management expense ratio for that investment. But I've also added a small ongoing super fee just to reflect the fact that some funds do charge these admin and platform fees. And then you end up with a final balance at 448, and then that number then goes down here, and then you do the same thing and you wash, rinse, repeat. I've assumed Jane's salary is increasing by 5% every year, not unreasonable for professional services. In fact, it's quite conservative. And so in the end, with a high growth investment, you're going to end up with 2.02 mil. Pretty simple model. If we go down to geared, all of the numbers are exactly the same. Like the philosophy, the thinking, all of it is identical. There is only one material change, and it is right there. The earnings is no longer 8.1%. Again, using super ratings long-term data, the most appropriate long-term return I could find for a geared investment was 11.5%. Before tax, and then when you take into account tax, you're around 10.4. So I'm not trying to do anything ridiculous here. I'm not trying to quote some outlandish numbers. I'm using long-term historical numbers to justify this model. Now, surprise, surprise, the compounding effect of earning 10.4% instead of 8.1% is actually a lot of money at the end. In the first year, it's only a small difference. There's 41,000 of growth instead of 32,400. But as that happens year in, year out, and growth begets growth, you end up with almost 2.7 mil of final balance, which is really good. It's a heck of a lot better, notwithstanding that this journey would be much more volatile. So then let's go across to the SMSF. Now, believe it or not, I've dialed this model down in order to make it as digestible as possible for the average Australian. The goal is also that if you'd like to play with this yourself, then feel free to do so. But you'll find that the rationale and that objective approach that I've taken with the previous two models is exactly the same here. So let me speak to what we've done here. Firstly, we have a start balance which is lower. Why? Because we've got 197,000. We started off with 400,000, but bear in mind, in this scenario, we're buying an $800,000 investment property with an 80% loan to value ratio, which means you need to fund 20% of that, which of course would be a $160,000 deposit. Now, it's pretty hard to get any SMSF lending above 80%. A lot of lenders will only offer 70%. So with that in mind, 80 is a pretty reasonable number to put in here. So we're using 160,000 of that, and then you've also got some other transactional costs, around about $40,000, and then you've also got SMSF setup costs over here. And the byproduct of this is that we've got 197, and of course that's your starting cash balance, noting that separately you'd have an investment property, which we'll talk about to the side. Now, because I'm such a good guy, I have assumed that this particular investment grows at 8.1% every year, which is insane. And the reason that it is because what I'm saying, I'm imagining that every single dollar of the excess cash in the self-managed superannuation fund is invested in line with a high growth allocation. That's silly, full stop. Practically speaking, you'd need probably around $20,000 a year of cash that would just sit there just to fund all of your self-managed superannuation fund costs and the like. But I didn't want to have any gripes about this, so I've operated under this silly assumption that all money is invested all the way through, which is, of course, very much in favor of this SMSF model. The contributions are exactly the same. This time we get rent. Modeling down here, I've assumed 3.5% yield, rental income, which is a totally reasonable number. And also I've outrageously generously put in a 5.4% compound annual growth rate for the property, which is in line with the last 30 years. That's the 30-year long-term average. And it's pretty ridiculous for anyone to assume that the massive property boom that we've had over the last 30 years is going to continue for another 30 years. For a whole host of reasons. Interest rates, of course, we saw them come down enormously throughout that 30-year period, which really helped property purchase prices. We also saw a trend of people going and households going to double incomes rather than single incomes, so purchasing power increased. We had much bigger net overseas migration, and migration policies were very pronounced. All of these things, it would be very, very unlikely to see the same rate of return. So I've assumed it anyway. Just let's get that monkey off our back in terms of what those numbers are. So there's the rent on the $800,000 property at 3.5%. Then you've got some super fees. As you can see, those super fees down here are your 0.3%. So apples for apples. Like if you're going to have some sort of platform or something along those lines for this cash balance and what you're doing with the investments. We've got SMSF expenses, pretty straightforward here. And then you've got some property holding costs. They're denoted just there. Land tax, and there's your tax refund. With your tax refund, incidentally, I wanted to really do this properly. The tax refund has been put in here to reflect the fact that all of these costs over here are actually deductible. And so I wanted to make sure that 15% of that does come back, and that's what I've got over there. And so the end cash balance, after you go through this washing machine of various different costs, you finish up with an end cash balance of about $195,000. So then that number evolves and changes and so on, and the cash balance is growing over time, and you end up with a pretty substantial chunk of investment over this from now until 2040. So all good. This is not too dissimilar, this part here, to the models that you've seen over there. It just has a couple of extra line items, a few extra costs to provision for the SMSF in particular. Now, if we move across to this section here, we now are talking about the property. So we've got a start loan balance of $640,000. The repayments are dialed in based on the assumption of a 6.2% interest rate, which, by the way, is extremely generous. The long-term interest rate, let me say that again, the current interest rate that you're getting for an investment property is almost always north of 6.5. If you're getting less than 6.5, it is probably because you're a mortgage broker. There's almost no other circumstance where you'd get that. But I put it at 6.2 to anticipate a few rate cuts. I spoke to a broker recently about this, and they said that about 6.7 would be right. So I've priced in a few rate cuts here to take that into account. These repayments reflect 6.2%, $640,000 borrowed, and then we have interest component, and then obviously that's how the loan balance is deteriorating over time. So firstly, you've got your loan balance that's slowly falling over time, and then you also have your property value, which hopefully is going up. And so again, the assumption here, $800,000, and then we're assuming 5.4% growth every single year all the way through this model. Now, if we sell the property, though, it's not quite as simple, because firstly, we're going to have a few transaction costs along the way. I've assumed 2% transaction costs when the property is sold. Pretty reasonable all in all. And then also we have tax to take into account. And this is a complicated situation, but basically but to keep it very, very simple, this part is assuming that you pay 10% tax on the capital gain and we've got some discounting here that makes it as fair as it possibly can. Now, I'm very mindful. Some of you might say, hang on a moment, but what about if I'm buying a property and I'm going to hold it until I meet a condition of release, and then when I sell it, there's no CGT? Yes, that will make a difference. In fact, if Jane was 5 years older and then she got to age 60 and met a condition of release, Good job, Jane. She's going to save about 120 grand in tax here, which is really helpful. But let's bear in mind that this was inferior by hundreds of thousands of dollars, not by 120,000. So even after that, you're worse off. Now, I also note that if we're talking an apples for apples comparison, you can do the same through a superannuation account that invests in equities. For example, you could invest in a wrap facility and you could hold long-term ETFs, your VASs and the like, and you hold those for the next 20 years and they'll grow materially in value. Capital gain will be significant. Similarly, you can sell. Now, when I've done these returns over here, I've assumed tax for all of that growth along the way. So that argument's somewhat redundant because we're now starting to stray from the apples for apples comparison. So on the left-hand side, we've got all of your we've got what happens to the cash in your SMSF, and of course the assumption that all this cash is invested, but that's what's happening from a cash balance perspective. And on this side over here, you have your property valuation. And this number here, to be clear, the most important one is the property value. It's this section there. This is based on if you were to sell it in any given year. So the real value is here, but then practically once you sell it, that's where you're going to land. The long and the short is that as you can see, as this grows, this is bubbling along, which is great, but you just never catch up from the original fall that you have based on the transaction costs. That's why these numbers both start at all these values start at the same, the geared growth investment and the high growth investment, but the SMSF with investment property starts at a lower value, about 10% lower. It's because you've got transaction costs of around about 10% of the fund, about $40,000 for your $800,000 investment property purchase, and that's pretty hard to recover. So that's the first thing that makes that really, really difficult. But these numbers, all in all, are they really, really do speak to the idea that this strategy doesn't stack up anymore. So let's come back over here for a moment. Spoke about property earnings. Just want to double down on this, please, which is that this is from what was formerly CoreLogic is now Cotality. God knows why they rebranded. But what they've said here is that dwelling values increased 382%, which is in compounding terms is 5.4% on average since July 1992. So that's a 30-year period of data, 1992 to 2022, which is the best I could find. Now, if you hit it out of the park and were lucky enough to choose Melbourne over that time, you would have got 5.9. Regionally, if you were hit it out of the park, you would have chosen Tassie over that time and got 5.2. But I think this speaks to the idea that whilst there are some 5.9s and there are some 5.7s, there's also some 4.5s and some other numbers that are nowhere near as palatable. All right, why am I always being told it's such a great strategy if you have just run the numbers and said that it doesn't work? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is because it was a great strategy. In the past, it was an amazing strategy. And if I can speak to this model here, let's look at where we land across at the end. We're at 1.67 mil. But if you had an SMSF with God, G-O-D, that's not religious, that's the good old days, then you absolutely would have done much better here. In fact, you would have worked out, if I've got these numbers right, you would have worked out marginally better than a high growth investment. Not as good as geared, but marginally better than high growth. So why was it so good in the past? It's because I used to have people come and sit down with me and say, I've got my self-managed superannuation fund, which has a property, and the interest rate on the property through Macquarie or whomever is 3.5%, or something ridiculously low. Those doors have closed, completely closed. Most banks have completely exited the self-managed superannuation space. It is a risky space to play in, and I don't see that changing. The SMSF lending space is going to continue to have very, very low competition. And because it has low competition, commensurately, it's going to have much higher margins. And therefore, you're going to be paying big premiums versus traditional lending in your own name. That trend is not going away. So in the past, if you were doing this from 2010 to 2020, you probably did really well. Power to you. The environment at the time was really conducive of hitting this out of the park. But things are different now. Now, I also made one other adjustment. I reduced land tax. I've had 1%. I pulled it down to 0.5%. And so if we look at these two compared to these numbers over here, what you can see, of course, everything else is identical. The only change is adjust these two values. But it goes to show how big a difference this interest rate premium, how big a difference it makes. because the difference between paying 3.5% through your self-managed superannuation fund loan versus paying 6.5 or 6.2% is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and completely either makes the strategy viable or it completely devalues. Now, the fact of the matter is that right now interest rates result and current environment for SMSF lending is that your rate is probably around about 6.7%. So right now it's an absolute hell no. If we ever got down to 5%, 4.75%, it might become palatable at that point. But respectfully, we ain't going there anytime soon, and that is why this is a sucker's play. Now, there's two other reasons why you might be told it's such a great strategy. The first one, of course, is that survivorship bias of, well, I've done it and it worked. Yes, because things were different then. Now things have changed. The second reason is perhaps a little bit more nefarious, and it is that this is it's such a sold strategy, an oversold strategy. There's so many individuals, I was about to call them professionals, I'm not going to use that word, that spruik self-managed superannuation funds to no end. They say, take control of your super. You're going to get better outcomes that way. And I'm here to tell you that you don't. You absolutely do not get better outcomes in almost all cases. You'd have to smash the market ridiculously. Like, go and become a property professional if you're that good at picking the properties. You'd have to smash it over the long term in order to outperform just a traditional fund. So despite all of the idea of, please take control of your super, you're going to get better outcomes, the reality is that you're going to be hard pressed to get better outcomes than just leaving it in your industry super fund or your retail superannuation fund. By all means, pick the right fund, get the right allocation, do those sorts of things. But this is not a winning strategy anymore. There's one other reason, and that I think that particularly with survivorship bias, why some people swear by this strategy, and I think it comes from a lack of awareness as to the impact of compounding growth. And what I mean by that is you might have some people that opened a self-managed super fund with $300,000. They buy a property, the property grows in value. 8 years later, the overall self-managed superannuation fund is worth $700,000. They say, yeah, this has served us well. But they're not aware that just compounding a loan plus their contributions would have got them to 750 or 800. They just don't, you don't quite understand that how quickly superannuation or any investment builds as the balance starts to grow quickly, and especially as you're making these higher mandatory contributions. So more of the same. It's this is a trap. Are there any exceptions? Yeah, there are. There's most of them are non-financial. For example, you might want to buy a property in your super fund because diversification is appropriate. I've got loads of money in a super fund, and it would be wise to pick some different assets other than just equities, for example. That could be a reason. Another reason, an obvious one, would be if you have or you want to get a commercial premises for work, for your business. It's not so much beneficial because you're using rent to pay yourself, because in reality, it sort of works out the same way. You use rent to pay someone else. You have an investment property in the SMSF, someone pays rent into that. That kind of works out evenly, but it's more so around the control. Personally, you can have a premises that you know is going to be our long-term home, and you can make decisions that way. You don't have the distraction of needing to move from one place to another. So that is a real thing. That's kind of it. Diversification and commercial property, specifically that you are using. If you already own an SMSF with a property in it, it might be really line ball. You've already paid the costs in order to get the SMSF set up, and so you've already taken those 10 steps backward. Sometimes that can make this strategy neutral, or you might be marginally better off. But other times, truly, especially if you own a dud property in an SMSF that hasn't been achieving your performance expectations, you got to evaluate that straight away, because holding that for the next 10, 15 years, stubbornly holding it because that's what we're doing with our super, could be one of the worst decisions that you make for your long-term retirement. So, if I may, this is dumb. The vast majority of the time, this is not a good strategy. As I said, I will share this spreadsheet. If you've got any comments, you want to rip it apart, go for it. The numbers will stack up. I'm very confident of it. It's a fairly basic model, but I'm happy to hear any objective criticism about how it could be improved. I want the truth as much as you do. And if you feel like there's something that I should iterate, then I'd love to hear about it. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you got a lot of value from this, and hopefully it inspires you to avoid this strategy more often. Thank you. Over and out.